Good morning. You're looking live at Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where SpaceX is getting ready to launch its 37th Falcon 9 rocket of the year. We'll be bringing you live coverage as SpaceX counts down to a liftoff at 3:10 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 7:10 UTC for our viewers around the world. The Falcon 9 is carrying another batch of Starlink satellites for the SpaceX broadband internet service. The rocket's first stage booster is making its 9th flight and will land on a drone ship in the Atlantic Ocean. I'm Stephen Young, and I'll be providing commentary from Spaceflight Now's News Bureau at the Kennedy Space Center press site. Stephen Clark has the weekend off. I'm joined by my colleague Adam Bernstein, who will be operating the cameras tonight and providing technical support. If you'd like to support our coverage of the space program, please go ahead and hit the thumbs up button to like this stream. And if you haven't already, click the subscribe button so you'll get notifications. That way you won't miss any of our future launch streams. You can also support our work financially by using the Super Chat feature or by becoming a member of our YouTube channel. We can't do these broadcasts without the support of our members and viewers. I'd like to thank everyone who's made a contribution to help fund our coverage. We're about 20 minutes away from the point in the countdown when the launch director will give a go for the start of propellant load for this morning's launch. SpaceX is running the countdown from its Launch and Landing Control Center just outside the south gate of Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. The launch team is also supported by control rooms at SpaceX headquarters in Hawthorne, California. At this point, the chief engineer should have already conducted a technical poll. We have had some stormy weather in the area tonight, but conditions do appear favorable for this morning's launch. The last forecast we received on Sunday from the 45th Weather Squadron gave a 90% chance of acceptable conditions for launch. The only concern this morning is a slight risk that the cumulus cloud rule could be violated. Cumulus clouds under certain conditions can expose the rocket to the threat of a lightning strike. We're not expecting any problems with upper-level winds or with the weather conditions out to sea in the booster recovery zone. Should they need it, SpaceX has a backup launch opportunity available at 4:52 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 8:42 UTC. Additional launch opportunities are available tomorrow. Let's take a look at the countdown timeline for today's Starlink 5-11 mission. At T-minus 38 minutes, we should hear the result of the go-no-go poll from the launch director. At T-minus 35 minutes, if the go was given, propellants will start to be pumped into the first stage liquid oxygen tank. At the same time, kerosene will be loaded onto the second stage. We'll also see kerosene loaded aboard the first stage at the same time. At T-minus 16 minutes, it's the turn of the liquid oxygen to start flowing into the second stage. Prior to this, we'll see the so-called big vent from the strongback structure at the launch pad. This happens as the feed lines are chilled down for the start of propellant load for the second stage. At T-minus 7 minutes, the chill down of the 9 Merlin engines will get underway. This involves flowing a small amount of liquid oxygen through the plumbing and turbo pumps. This will protect those engines from the risk of thermal shock and damage during the startup sequence. About 6 minutes prior to launch, the first stage kerosene tank should be full. And then at T-minus 4.5 minutes, we'll see the strongback begin to retract from the Falcon rocket. It will recline to an angle of about 1.5 degrees, leaning back ever so slightly from the Falcon 9. It will stay there until liftoff, and then at liftoff that strongback will pull back in a more rapid fashion to clear the way for the vertical climb of the Falcon 9 off the pad. At about 2 minutes, liquid oxygen loading should be complete. At this point, the Falcon 9 will be fully loaded with 1 million pounds of propellants. And then, in the final 60 seconds, the control of the countdown will be handed over from the ground sequencer to the Falcon 9's onboard computers. The propellant tanks will be brought up to flight pressure. The SpaceX launch director will give their go for liftoff, and then the engine ignition command will be issued at about T-minus 3 seconds. If all 9 engines ignite and are healthy, the flight computer will command hold-down clamps to release the Falcon 9 for liftoff at T0. Today's mission is called Starlink 5-11. It is the 88th SpaceX launch primarily dedicated to the deployment of the Starlink satellite constellation. This file photo shows what the satellites look like stacked in the launch configuration. It was taken before a previous Starlink launch and shows the satellites before they were encapsulated inside the fairing. One half of that fairing is seen here behind the stack of Starlink satellites. It's 43 feet or 17 meters tall. These 53 satellites will join the Starlink network, providing low latency, high-speed internet service to SpaceX's customers. There are currently more than 4,200 functioning Starlink satellites in orbit. The satellites were built at SpaceX's Starlink assembly line in Redmond, Washington, near Seattle. Each spacecraft weighs about 660 pounds or 300 kilograms at launch. They are solar-powered and use krypton-fueled ion engines to change and maintain their orbit. These satellites are known as Starlink version 1.5. This is the older generation of Starlink satellites. SpaceX recently started deploying its next generation of spacecraft called the Starlink V2 Mini. The satellites on the Starlink 5-11 mission are heading up to an operational orbit of 329 miles or 530 kilometers at an inclination of 43 degrees. The Falcon 9 upper stage will release the satellites into a lower orbit of about 300 kilometers, roughly 200 miles in altitude. The satellites will use their ion thrusters over the course of weeks and sometimes months to raise their altitude to the operational orbit of 329 miles. You can see what a ground user terminal looks like in this SpaceX publicity photo. This flat panel antenna can be mounted on a roof where it has an unobstructed view of the sky. Starlink also offers terminals and internet packages that can be used on the move for trains, planes, automobiles, and seagoing vessels. SpaceX recently revealed that Starlink was used during the Super Heavy Starship booster test in April. It was used to transmit data from the spacecraft as it was climbing back to the ground via the Starlink network. T-minus 40 minutes and counting. The next major milestone in the countdown is the go, no-go poll by the launch director for the start of the terminal count. The launch team is based at the SpaceX Launch and Landing Control Center. That's about 10 miles south of the launch pad near Port Canaveral. Inside the control center, engineers will be tracking the health of the Falcon 9 rocket, the ground facilities, and the Starlink satellites. They will also be receiving updates from the 45th Weather Squadron. This poll takes place electronically, unlike other launch teams who use a verbal poll. The launch team uses a mouse click to confirm they are go. Just a reminder, if you haven't done so already, please hit the thumbs up button to like our stream. We want to get as many people watching as possible, and that really helps us out. T-minus 37 minutes. We will hopefully be hearing the launch directors go for launch very soon.
Tanks venting for propellant load.
Well, with that call, that seems to be confirmation that SpaceX is proceeding with the countdown this morning. The vent for propellant loads is underway. The loading of propellant should begin at T-minus 35 minutes.
Attention operators on countdown. This time polling is complete. The team has polled go for propellant load and launch. Stand by for abort instructions.
And there we have confirmation from the launch director that we have a go
for
launch.
non-urgent, no-go conditions. Brief the CE or LD and they will approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operators shall call hold on the countdown net. Launch control will abort the launch auto sequence and immediately proceed into launch abort. In T-minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands-off, relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
T-minus 35 minutes and counting. Propellant load should now be underway at Space Launch Complex 40.
Launch auto sequence has started.
And there we have confirmation that the ground computers are now managing the automatic sequence to pump propellants aboard the Falcon 9 rocket. 3 of the 4 propellant tanks in the rocket will be loaded at this point. Those are the kerosene tanks on the first and second stage and the liquid oxygen tank on the first stage. With the start of propellant load, that locks in today's launch time at 3:10 and 50 seconds Eastern Time. The Falcon 9 uses a highly refined rocket-grade kerosene known as Rocket Propellant 1, or RP1 for short. The oxidizer is superchilled liquid oxygen. This densified oxygen allows SpaceX to pack in more propellant and gain more performance than is possible with regular liquid oxygen used by other rockets. Let's take a closer look at the Falcon 9 vehicle. It stands 70 meters or 229 feet tall and has a diameter of 3.7 meters or about 12 feet. The bottom two-thirds of the rocket is the first stage. Today's first stage booster has flown 8 times before. It is designated tail number 1073 in the SpaceX fleet. At the base of the first stage are the 9 Merlin engines, which burn rocket-grade kerosene and liquid oxygen to produce 1.7 million pounds of thrust. Around the engine compartment are the black carbon fiber landing legs that will be used to touch down on the drone ship. Above the first stage is the interstage. This is a composite structure consisting of an aluminum honeycomb core surrounded by carbon fiber. In the inset image, you can see the deployable hypersonic grid fins. These are titanium winglets that provide stability and steering for the Falcon 9 as it falls through the atmosphere tail first like a dart. At the top of the interstage are 3 mechanical latches that attach to the second stage. At first stage main engine cutoff, high pressure helium is used to release those latches, and 4 pneumatic pushers ensure there is a clean separation between the 2 parts of the rocket. The second stage engine nozzle is safely housed inside the interstage adapter until stage separation. The upper stage is powered by a single modified Merlin engine called a Merlin vacuum engine, or MVAC engine. It is equipped with a large nozzle optimized for burns in the vacuum of space. It produces more than 200,000 pounds of thrust. It will be fired twice on today's flight to place the 53 Starlink satellites into their intended orbit. The MVAC engine burns the same propellant mix, kerosene and liquid oxygen, as the first stage. It will ignite a 3rd time after the deployment of the Starlink satellites. That will be a deorbit burn to drive the upper stage back into the atmosphere where it will burn up. That eliminates the risk of creating any unnecessary space debris on this mission. At the very top of the rocket is the payload fairing, containing the stack of 53 Starlink satellites. The payload fairing is made up of a carbon composite material and is 13.1 meters or 43 feet tall and 5.2 meters, 17.1 feet in diameter. The 2 halves of the payload fairing will be recovered a little further downrange than where the first stage will land on the drone ship. The fairing halves will gently splash down under parachutes and be recovered by the recovery ship Bob, which will fish the fairing halves out of the water and return them to Cape Canaveral for refurbishment and reuse. As you can see, we're starting to see the first vapors around the first stage of the Falcon 9 as liquid oxygen is pumped aboard. This super cold fluid chills the outer skin of the Falcon 9, and what you're actually seeing is the moisture in the air and the air itself. It condenses and forms these vapors that you see around the rocket. You may also be able to make out a line of frost building up on the outer skin of the vehicle. Helium loading should now be underway into pressure vessels on the first stage. The helium is used to pressurize the propellant tanks during flight. Let's take a look at the flight history for this Falcon 9 booster. It's booster number 1073. It's making its 9th flight to space today after 8 previous missions. It first flew on a Starlink delivery mission just over a year ago. In December, it sent the Japanese Hakuto-R lander to the moon. Booster 1073 also launched 2 communication satellites and a cargo delivery mission to the International Space Station. It most recently flew just 54 days ago on the Starlink 6-2 mission. Now less than 24 minutes to the launch of the SpaceX Falcon 9 with another batch of Starlink satellites. At this point, cryogenic helium should now be being loaded into the storage tanks on the second stage of the rocket. Once again, that helium is used to pressurize the tanks. It is slightly warmed by it being passed through coils in the engine, and that causes it to expand and fill the gap left by the propellant as it is burnt during the launch. This morning's launch is taking place from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. The pad was originally constructed in the 1960s for the U.S. Air Force's Titan rocket program. It's located at the north end of Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, right on the border with NASA's Kennedy Space Center. T-minus 21 minutes and counting. Everything appears to be going smoothly as SpaceX counts down to liftoff of the Starlink 5-11 mission.
Stage 2, RP1 load complete.
That call indicates that the load of kerosene aboard the first stage is complete. We are now seeing what is known as the big vent by observers of the SpaceX program. This vent is cooling the plumbing inside the strungback ahead of the start of loading of liquid oxygen aboard the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. This big vent, which is chilling the plumbing inside that strongback structure that you see there up against the side of the rocket on the right-hand side of the vehicle, that should be concluding soon, and the loading of liquid oxygen on the second stage will begin.
Start of stage 2 lock float.
And there we have confirmation that stage 2 is now starting to receive its load of liquid oxygen. That liquid oxygen is being pumped up the lines that were chilled by that large vent that we just witnessed. Loading of liquid oxygen continues on the second stage and the first stage. T-minus 15 minutes and counting. Let's take a look at the trajectory for the Falcon 9. It will head south from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. We've labeled the launch pad Slick 40. That's Space Launch Complex 40. The departure point for today's mission. The red line shows the expected ground track at the first stage of the Falcon 9. It will perform a dogleg maneuver to avoid crossing the Bahamas. The first stage will make a landing on the drone ship. Just read the instructions about 8.5 minutes into the flight. The second stage will continue to orbit. The landing site is about 400 miles downrange from Cape Canaveral. SpaceX operates 3 drone ships. They're converted ocean-going barges. It calls them autonomous spaceport drone ships. SpaceX named them after the spacecraft featured in the science fiction series Culture. The drone ship being used this morning is the second to be given the name. Just read the instructions. The first drone ship with that name was retired in 2015 after being damaged in a landing failure. The new Just Read the Instructions entered service in 2016 on the West Coast, supporting launches from Vandenberg in California. It was moved to Cape Canaveral in 2019 and supported its first launch from Cape Canaveral in June 2020. T-minus 11 minutes and counting. Conditions here at Cape Canaveral continue to look favorable for launch. A crescent moon has risen above the horizon. We still have clear skies above our heads here at the Kennedy Space Center press site, but there is some cloud in the area. Hopefully it will not obscure our view of today's launch. T-minus 10 minutes and counting. Let's take a quick look at the launch timeline. After liftoff, about a minute into flight, the vehicle will experience maximum dynamic pressure. That's when the rocket's forward velocity and the atmosphere's density are at their peak and pressures on the vehicle structure at their highest. After that, and the atmosphere thins, the dynamic stress is reduced. The first stage will cut off at about 2 minutes, 25 seconds into flight. That will be followed quickly by stage separation, the two stages being pushed apart by pneumatic pushers. Second stage ignition will occur, and shortly after that we'll have jettison of the payload fairing, which will parachute to a recovery in the Atlantic. The first stage will start its descent and fire its engines to prevent it overheating as it begins to enter the atmosphere and friction builds up. Finally, the first stage landing burn occurs and we have touchdown on the drone ship. Just read the instructions. 8 minutes and 25 seconds into flight. Meanwhile, the second stage will be continuing its flight for just a few more seconds before the first cutoff. We then have a coast phase of about 48 minutes, and then the second stage will restart for just a few seconds to complete placing the Starlink satellites in their planned orbit. And we just heard the engine chill sequence is now underway. A small amount of liquid oxygen is being flowed through the Merlin engine turbopumps to cool them ahead of engine start. That prevents any damage from thermal shock when the engines start their ignition sequence.
Stage 1, RP1 load complete.
Loading of kerosene aboard the first stage is now complete. Loading of oxygen continues on both stages. We're now within 5 minutes to launch. Everything is looking good so far for a launch at 3:10 a.m. The next step will be the retraction of the strung back, which sits alongside the rocket at the launch pad. The rocket's propellant tanks will be pressurized ahead of this for structural strength.
Strong back retract has started.
And there we heard the call that strung back retraction has begun. The strung back clamps, which have been wrapped around the top of the second stage, will start opening. The strung back retracts to an angle of about 1.5 degrees. At liftoff, it will swing back further away from the vehicle so the rocket can clear the launch pad.
Stage 1 lock load complete.
The second stage liquid oxygen tank is now full. Can now clearly see the gap between the rocket and the strung back as it is pulled away from the vehicle. T-minus 2 minutes.
Stage 2 lock flow complete.
The Falcon 9 is now fully loaded with 1 million pounds of propellants. We're seeing some venting at the launch pad as SpaceX purges the strung back propellant lines prior to launch. We're approaching the final minute of the countdown. At T-minus 1 minute, the Falcon 9's flight computers will take control. Stage 1 and 2 will pressurize for flight. The onboard computer will perform checks of the first stage engine steering system.
Ground gas closeouts.
Everything is on track for liftoff of the Falcon 9 at 3:10 a.m. Eastern Time.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
And there we have confirmation that the onboard computers have taken control of the countdown. Let's listen in for the launch director's final go for launch.
Go for launch.
And there we have it. Falcon 9 is cleared for launch. In the final seconds of the countdown, look out for the green flash of the T-TEB ignition fluid. Once the 9 Merlin engines reach full thrust, hold down clamps will release the rocket. After liftoff, it will take about 25 seconds for the roar of the engines to reach our location. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of the Falcon 9, carrying 53 Starlink satellites. And the Falcon 9 has cleared the launch towers. The Falcon 9 is now pitching downrange, heading southeast. Let's listen in to the roar of those 9 Merlin engines. Those Merlin engines should be throttling down as the vehicle approaches max Q. SpaceX reports nominal propulsion. The Falcon 9 is now traveling faster than the speed of sound and is experiencing maximum dynamic pressure. We have less than a minute now left in the burn of the first stage. Those Merlin engines are producing 1.7 million pounds of thrust. The Falcon 9 is now already 25 kilometers in altitude. Getting spectacular views of those 9 Merlin engines and their plume. The second stage engine should be in chill down. We are approaching main engine cutoff, or MECO. There we have main engine cutoff.
MECO.
And second stage ignition.
Stage separation.
Now looking at onboard camera views from SpaceX, showing that separation a few moments ago. The SpaceX video comes to us with a little bit of a delay.
Fairing separation confirmed.
And there's separation of the payload fairing. We're seeing the 53 Starlink satellites stacked atop the rocket. On the right side of your screen, you're seeing the red-hot second stage engine nozzle. And on the left side of the screen is a camera looking down on the first stage, which is now continuing to climb, but heading towards a landing on the drone ship. It will reach its peak altitude soon and start descending. Our camera at Kennedy Space Center still tracking the second stage. You could just see that pinpoint of light. less than 2 minutes to the entry burn by the first stage. The second stage continues to fire. That second stage has about another 4 minutes to fire. And there is the second stage, still a pinpoint of light in the sky here at Cape Canaveral. Great tracking work by Adam Bernstein, operating our camera here at Kennedy Space Center. Now less than a minute to the entry burn by the Falcon 9's returning first stage booster. This burn will slow its descent and reduce heating on the vehicle as it encounters friction from the atmosphere. As you can see by the speed and altitude dials on the left side of the screen, the booster is picking up speed and falling. Should be about 14 seconds from the burn.
Stage 1 FTS is saved.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
And there's ignition of the first stage for the entry burn. This is a burn with 3 engines. Getting a view from our camera here at the Kennedy Space Center of that burn. Looks like it may have passed by in clouds, or we've already had cutoff. Returning to the onboard
Stage
cameras.
2 FTS is saved.
Stage 1 entry burn shut down.
And there we have confirmation that the first stage entry burn has been completed. The second stage, meanwhile, continues its ascent, now traveling at more than 17,000 kilometers per hour at an altitude of 161 kilometers. Meanwhile, the first stage is continuing its descent towards the drone ship. Just read the instructions. It's stationed about 400 miles downrange from Cape Canaveral.
Stage 1 transonic.
The Falcon 9 first stage is now slowing below the speed of sound. Landing burn is coming up.
Stage 1 landing burn.
And there we see
Stage
the
2 thermal
stage
balance.
1 landing burn underway, a single Merlin engine firing.
Landing leg deploy.
Drone ship coming into view. And
Stage 1
touchdown.
landing confirmed.
And SpaceX confirms a successful landing on the drone ship. Just read the instructions.
Expected loss of signal, Cape.
MVAC shutdown.
And there's shutdown of the Merlin vacuum engine on the second stage.
Nominal orbit insertion.
The second stage is now beginning a approximately 45-minute coast before reigniting its engine to finalize the orbit that the Starlink satellites will be deployed into.
Expected loss of signal Bermuda.
Today's landing was the 199th successful landing of a Falcon 9 booster. Well, with the Falcon 9 first stage safely on the drone ship and the second stage in a parking orbit coasting for about another 40 minutes or so, we're going to conclude our live coverage here at this stream. We will continue to bring you SpaceX mission audio in our Launchpad live stream. The deployment of the Starlink satellites should occur about 1 hour after launch. So if you want to follow along and get confirmation from the SpaceX mission audio, that will be carried in our Launchpad live stream. But if you're anxious to see another SpaceX launch, the good news is there's another one today, this time from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. The Transporter 8 mission is scheduled for launch this afternoon. Liftoff should occur at 2:14 p.m. Pacific time. That's 5:14 p.m. Eastern time or 21:14 UTC. That's a launch of a multitude of satellites, a rideshare mission, as SpaceX calls them, on its Falcon 9 flying from Vandenberg later today, the second Falcon 9 scheduled for launch today. We've already seen the first of those two launches. On June 16th, historic day, the final launch of an Ariane 5. That's taking place from the Guiana Space Center in French Guiana. The Falcon 9 will be back on Launchpad 40 on June 19th. That's for the launch of the Setara satellite for Indonesia. That's a communication satellite for the Indonesian government. Then we have another launch here from Cape Canaveral, the first United Launch Alliance launch of the year. That's scheduled for June 21st. It's the penultimate Delta IV Heavy launch. Only one more after this upcoming launch. It's carrying a classified payload for the National Reconnaissance Office that will be launching from Space Launch Complex 37B. That's a little south of Pad 40, where we saw the Falcon 9 launch from tonight. And then possibly later in June, another Starlink launch from Pad 40. SpaceX had hoped to get that mission off this week, but delays with the previous launches of the cargo resupply mission to the International Space Station and another batch of Starlink satellites that flew on the 4th of June, that caused some disruption to SpaceX's schedule, and that launch now will probably take place later in the month. We don't have an exact date for that. So the Falcon 9 second stage is passing high above the coast of South America, heading south out over the Atlantic Ocean shortly. Here's one last look at Space Launch Complex 40. Don't forget, you can continue to listen to Countdown Audio on our Launchpad live stream, and you should be redirected there when this stream ends. So thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you to my colleague Adam Bernstein for operating the camera tonight and providing production support. Don't forget to visit spaceflightnow.com for full coverage of the Transporter 8 launch later today. So with that, it's good night from Cape Canaveral.